I like to use loops whenever I'm working with a data set and I would like to evaluate each row in sequence. And so if you think about a loop as an action that's going to get repeated until a condition is met. Now, the problem with that concept is that there's some loops that can
All right, start by downloading the companion file from that'ssobasic.com, or you can simply just create a blank workbook, and then I'm just going to have some really basic data here. If you want to just create that really quick, that's totally fine. You will be able to do it in no time at all. And then go to your module, and we'll go over some really basic loops. Type sub basic loop, and the first loop that we're going to go into is it's counting upwards. So we're going to have an integer that's going to count. It's going to begin at a starting point. It's going to end at whatever ending point that we indicate. So if I start out with the number 2 and I'm saying just count from 2 to 8, it's going to start out with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then stop at 8. And it really is up to you to define that starting and ending point. And so in this case, if I was just visually looking at my data, then I would go from 2 to 24. But that's not particularly inclusive of the idea that somebody might add new data into your data table. So I recommend before watching this lecture that you should have already watched the last row lecture that goes over how to count the size of your data, because I'm going to use that line of code really quickly. Again, as I mentioned before, you don't need to memorize this right away. It's kind of confusing, but I do want you to be able to just say, I don't know, put it on a text file and then copy it from time to time to use for your purposes. So what I've typed out here is last row equals cells rows.count. Count what column? A. Go to the bottom of the sheet, go all the way up and find the first non-blank cell, which happens to be here, and then return the row property. If that confuses you, again, go to the last row lecture. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to count from wherever our data starts, which happens to be 2, because normally we might have a header here, right? And we'll say for I equals 2 to last row, and then simply we're going to say next I. And what's happening here is I is going to begin at the value you place right after the equal sign, and then it's going to count upwards to whatever number you indicate last. So I definitely could have just put a single number here, but in my case, I prefer a variable because my data is dynamic and the point to which I'm counting towards being the last set of data is going to be dynamic. So we're dynamically counting to the end of the data. So here, let's say my val equals range. We're going to now use what's called a concatenate to combine the column letter A, which happens to be where the data that we're evaluating, with the row number 2, which is going to change with each iteration of the loop. So I is going to equal 2, and then I is going to equal 3, then I will equal 4, I will equal 5. So hopefully you're watching my mouse cursor here, that I'm indicating it's not that I is going to be the row itself. I is simply the number that represents this row. So we're going to combine the letter associated with the column with the simple number, or you could put it as a text string or a number type. It really wouldn't matter. It would be able to figure it out. And we're going to put I like to use strings, so let's say dim I as string, and that's going to take 2 strings and combine them, so that if this was the number 2, which is where we're going to start, this would become A2. We go here and we see A2. So let's say value 2, value 3. We'll make it a little bit more interesting so that we can see different values getting assigned throughout our loop. And I is automatically going to increase in value every time it gets to this line, and then it will loop all the way back up here and then continue with the next number. So let's just demo that really quick. I got a type mismatch. So, oh, sorry, for counting, you need to do a counting friendly variable. So counting is a numerical operation, so you have to use either an integer or a long type variable. So now last row, if we're being really good, we would declare everything. We would use option explicit. I'm just giving you a quick example. So last row is also going to be a long type variable or an integer if you so declare. So now we've got the number 2 is being assigned to I, and so my val is going to be the contents of range A2. So now I see value 2. My val continues to be 3, and then 4. And so I'm just hitting F8, and I'm just seeing it assign different values. Now I'll hit stop really quick, and we're going to write a different loop. We're going to write a for each loop. Let's also go up and just label this one as well. For loop. And this is a numerical iteration. Okay, so for each loop is looking at a member set. So if we're talking about the collective worksheets that exist within your workbook, this particular workbook only has one worksheet. It's called sheet 1 and is basic loop.xlsm. But say, for example, this other fx macro has many sheets in it, so it might be helpful if I was to be able to loop through each of them. So regardless of which workbook you're talking about, you can say for each worksheet in worksheets. And so remember, if I'm putting the plural worksheets here, I'm talking about a collection of many worksheets. And then this is a singular object that I can call whatever I want. I could call it my worksheet, or I could call it WS each. It's really up to you. I like to use WS because it's pretty generic, and then I can declare it WS as worksheet. I can also turn on option explicit. This is going to force me to declare variables as I go along. And then type next worksheet. So this loop is closed off by the same way as I did with the numerical iteration. And this is looping for each item in a set. And so if I was to say ws.name, we'll turn that into a quick message box, and I will show you, because I turned on option explicit, it wants me to define last row. So last row as long. Option explicit means define everything. So my val string, and then that should be all of them. So message box, well, you don't want to equal sign, I made a syntax error. So what you saw just there, that's compiling. The code will not run until it's passed all of its necessary checks to be able to convert Visual Basic into the main programming language that will then be executed. This is sort of like the visual interface of what's happening. Hit F8. I'm going to just drag this yellow arrow down to my next loop so that this is the next thing that will execute. We already looked at this loop, so we're really moving on to here. Hit F8, and now I will get a message box that says sheet 1. So you can see I only have one sheet. I'm going to immediately exit the loop. Not super exciting unless I had multiple sheets, but you get the gist of it. Actually, to make sure you get the gist of it, let's go ahead and add another sheet. We can drag our yellow arrow up and hit F8. It says sheet 1. I hit OK. It's going to go back to the top of the loop. You'll notice that when I re-execute the next set in a loop, it doesn't actually go up to this yellow line, this top line, the for each or the for I, it only executes at the beginning. So your loop is going to, when it gets to the next part, go up to the first executable line of code. So then I'm going to get the message box sheet too. All right, now go past your end sub that stops it from playing. You can always just hit the stop sign. And now we're going to go over a do loop. So let's do until. For do until, I'm going to execute a set of statements until a condition is met. So let's say I'm going to do something until the cell reference is blank. So we'll say until my val equals VB null string. Oh, I don't want to comment there. I want this to be an executable line of code. Then I'll put a comment here that says do an action until a condition is met. And then I'm just going to type loop. I don't have to put a variable here because it's not really an iteration. So an iteration, I mean that it's a set of numbers or it's a set of objects that are being looped through as kind of a collection of some kind, while a do until is merely a conditional statement. So if I was to first say my val equals a range a and I, in this first example, I has assumed the ending value of this loop in our previous example. So I was like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it ended at 24. And so we don't want I to be 24. We want to kind of reset I as sort of a counter here, right? So we're going to set I equal to 2 as a starting point. And now I is going to start here, and we're going to have to physically add 1 to the variable I to make it 3. Then we're going to add 1 to the variable I to make it 4, and we're kind of manually iterating it upwards until we get to a blank cell. So I equals I plus 1 is an integral step to using a do until loop. Because if I don't put this in here, my val will never be blank and the loop will just continue on indefinitely. So in this case, I'm kind of giving you an example of a problematic data set. Imagine that every day you come into work and you work with pretty, sound data. It looks the same every day. It doesn't have any noticeable gaps in it. And then somebody is looking through the records and maybe they do it accidentally, maybe on purpose, but a record has been deleted. And you would want your program to continue past an empty record set all the way to the bottom regardless, right? And so this is an example of why I generally don't ever use a do until loop, because I might stop early. So here, if I was to hit F8 again, and then instead of dragging the yellow arrow, I'm just going to right click in the margin here and click set next statement. Hit F8 and you will see, oops, we probably should have given my val kind of an initial value to start us out. Because my val was an empty variable to begin with, so if I'm going to do a loop of this sort, I need to start out giving a value to evaluate, and my val is going to start out in A2 here, and it's going to have value 2. And so do until my val equals VB null string. So this loop's going to continue until we get to this cell here, A11 equals VB null string. And just for kicks, to make this a little bit shorter, why don't we delete something here like A4? And then that way it won't take us as long to get there. So now I equals 3 because we added 1 to it. We started out at 2, and now I equals 3. So we're evaluating range A and I. So that's going to be A3. So my val equals value 3, which is right there as you can see it. We'll go ahead and add I with 1 bringing it up to I equals 4. My val doesn't yet equal VB null string because I actually did these out of order. But my val now equals VB null string. So it went ahead and evaluated a 4 here, and then is going to exit the loop on the next iteration, because only at this point has it become VB null string and the event has been triggered to exit the loop. And I guess I should have explained that when I use VB null string, I'm specifically talking about uh, an empty string set. So whenever you're evaluating cell contents, a blank cell can be evaluated as a numerical 0, or it can be evaluated as a blank string, which can be signified by double quotes, or by the word VB null string, which I tend to use sometimes. Okay, so lastly, we're going to do a do while loop. So we'll say do while my val is not equal. So I use not equal with the greater than equal to sign facing each other. And we'll say not equal to VB null string. Again, we're going to set I equals 2. We're going to set a sort of starting point of my val equals range A and I. So kind of going back to this, if I wanted to have it exit right away, I could reevaluate the variable before I exit the loop. So it's like I've evaluated the variable, I've added one step iteration, and then reassigned the variable for the purposes of deciding if I do or don't want to evaluate its next assignment. I encourage you to like think through what's going to happen by creating sample data sets and really deciding what's appropriate for the decision process that I'm trying to make. Again, I personally am a much bigger fan of these two. Originally, I was just going to show these two. As mentioned in the intro video, I said I was going to show you 2 loops. I wanted to go ahead and show you these 2 loops as well because even though I don't use them pretty much ever, I did want to explain them so that when you see them elsewhere, you know what's going on. So a do while does a condition while it's true. So do while will execute statements while the condition is false. A do until will execute the statements until the condition is basically true. So do until this condition is true, execute this statement repeatedly until this condition is true, while do while is execute the code in between these 2 lines of code while this condition is true. So they're pretty much just flip-flop opposite of each other. This one was saying, don't stop this loop until I find a blank cell. While this one is saying, continue doing this loop while the cell is not blank. So you might want to think about that for a second, but that's what they're doing. They're doing the opposite of each other. So in this case, it would be the same kind of concept. My val equals range, A and I. You do whatever you want with my val, and then you would add 1 to I so that the loop increases and you don't just get stuck in a loop that continues on forever. And then you would reevaluate my val for the sake of deciding if you want to exit the loop on the next iteration. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to leave you with before we kind of stop this lesson is that with any of these loops, you can go from top to bottom or bottom to top. So in this case, we went from 2 to last row. We could have also gone from last row to 2. So we could do a for loop backwards by doing for I equals last row to 2. And by default, the loop wants to count upwards, and so it wouldn't make sense if my last row is 24 and I'm trying to count to 2, because it would go like to 25 and 26, and so that would not work. But I can type step -1. And step -1 means that it's going to count backwards. It's going to go from 24 to 23 to 22. So I realize that's a lot going on with loops, but I think the takeaway I want you to get is that the basic loop that you're going to be working with is this one here that says for some starting point to an ending point, execute some code. And I'm usually going to use that to indicate a specific row. And then the next loop that I'm going to use quite a bit is to loop through a set of objects within a collection. So saying for each workbook, in the collective workbooks that are open, or each worksheet, or possibly each cell within a range. These are going to be some very powerful loops for you to use. So thanks for joining, and I hope to see you in the next video, joining us for the next topic.